Bronfenbrenner's systems theory in its various guises, I think, dominates so much of educational discourse and research and psychology. And so I cannot think of anyone in the world more synonymous with Bronfenbrenner's work than our next speaker, Professor Jonathan Tudge. Professor Jonathan Tudge is an emeritus professor of human development and family studies at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, USA. John was educated in the UK with a BA in history from Lancaster and an MPhil in sociology from Oxford. He trained as an infant school teacher and worked as a teacher for 5 years in London and 2 years in Moscow, while also working in Estonia, even though it's not officially on his bio here that I've been given, before moving to the United States to gain his PhD from the Department of Human Development at Cornell. He joined the Department of Human Development and Family Studies at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro in 1988 and retired in 2019 as Professor Emeritus. He's the author of several books, including Everyday Lives of Young Children, Culture, Class and Child Rearing in Diverse Societies, 2008, Developing Gratitude in Children and Adolescents, 2008, and Understanding and Teaching Bronfenbrenner's Bioecological Theory, 2026. Just to note as well is that he is a devout Oxford United fan, but there's no truth to the rumours that he's going to use his systems theory skills as the next manager of Oxford United to save them from relegation. I'll hand over to John. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Nice introduction, particularly getting in the Oxford United. I'm only wearing this tie because it's an Oxford United tie. The only way my wife could get me to wear a tie was to buy one with the symbol of the team. So, thank you, Paul. Thank you, Sheila. Thank you, Liz, for the invitation. Thank you, Erica, for your very wide-ranging presentation. Mine will be a little on the narrow side by comparison. Agency in Systems and Development Psychology, obviously related to these two books, which I read with great interest. But I think they both could have been helped with more attention to your favourite theorist and mine, Jürgen Bronfenbrenner. So how do these two books take us forward? Actually, Erica did a very nice job already of talking about that. But just briefly, some of the things that they both really argue for, that we need to get away from exclusive to inclusive systems. This notion of dealing with dichotomies is so much less relevant than talking in terms of relational interdependencies, really. The child as passive, no. A lot of people have not talked about the child as passive, but we need to think about the child as actively involved. And rather than think about agency as individual versus sociocultural, we need to think about agency as both individual and sociocultural or relational agency. We need to get away from diametric spatial opposition and talk more in terms and think more in terms of ecological systems. So, for example, Sheila and Liz wrote, children need to view children as biopsychological organisms who become what they become and act as they act through their transactions in and with their environment. Agency is seen by them as intentional activity, but necessarily linked to enculturation. All diametric spatial opposition presupposes division and separation between the individual and environment or system. Ecological systems represent a direct challenge to such a diametric spatial framing precondition. And I think that Bronfenbrenner's theory is relevant, totally relevant to each of these points above. It's first important to stress that Bronfenbrenner was not a professor of psychology. His degrees were in music, education, and psychology, but all but 2 years of his working life was spent in a department first called Child Development and Family Relations, and then Human Development and Family Studies, in the School of Human Ecology at Cornell, which was where I got my PhD. I'm also not a psychologist. I have been in the Department of Psychology. My postdoc was in one, but I just worked with Barbara Rogoff, very much a cultural developmentalist. So, I think it helps to come from a different discipline. So in the UK and in Ireland, as Sheila and Liz wrote, it may be necessary to draw upon the social sciences to, quote, soften psychology. But in the United States, I think the Departments of Human Development and Family Studies serve that purpose. And so I'm going to go back in history a little bit and explain why. Paul mentioned Haeckel's work and the first mention of what he called ecology in the late 19th century. Of more relevance to the United States was a woman called Helen Swallow Richards, who wanted the new burgeoning field to be named human ecology. She lost out, unfortunately. It became known as home economics. Terrible name. The school at Cornell, where human development was human ecology. The school that I went to at Greensboro actually had been called home economics until just a couple of years before I went there. I would not have gone. That's terrible, really. I'm totally biased against that name. It sounds awful. Anyway, that we'll see why departments like that come from a background in human ecology are so important for this argument. But I'm going to go even further back, talk a little bit about Aristotle and efficient material, formal and final causes, but also about Pepper's work, which is actually more relevant to psychology, his notion of these three paradigms or worldviews that are really relevant: mechanism, organicism, and contextualism. Mechanism, of course, the mechanists deal with independent antecedent conditions. They only accept material that is coming from within or efficient causes coming from the external world. Psychology, as practiced in the United States, and I suspect in the UK and Ireland too, is dominated by mechanists. And that's an argument that Sheila and Liz made. Although I think the influence of mechanism in psychology departments is much more at the level of methods and analysis, not at the level of theory. It tends to be reductionistic, it's positivistic, and it's different in so many ways from organicism and contextualism. Organicists do not accept either efficient or material causes, but what they call formal cause, which is a dialectical interdependence of child and environment, for example. They also accept the notion of a final cause, that there's a universal directionality to development. So you can think about Piaget, Erikson, and most recently, Overton. They're total organicists. Contextualists accept that formal cause notion, the synergy, bidirectional interdependence, that development is necessarily influenced by the sociocultural context. We also influence that sociocultural context. Vygotsky and Bronfenbrenner will be the two primary examples of contextualists. The difference between contextualists and organicists is that contextualists do not accept this notion of a general, universal directionality to development. They both accept the notion of formal cause or synergy. The human ecology, given its roots, is much more sympathetic to contextualism than I think is psychology. And that little star by Knott, I should point out that he actually had a joint appointment with psychology for much of his career. So now I'm going to talk about Bronfenbrenner's theory and explain why I think it's really relevant to the arguments that Sheila and Liz on one hand and Paul on the other are making. So the question is, which version of the theory? There are three, I think, clear phases in the developmental theory, 73 to 79, 80 to 93. The dates are not exact, but 94 to 2006. I think of the third and final phase as the mature form of the theory, its most developed form, and all things I might have been too much influenced by chronocentrism or the notion that later stuff is necessarily better than earlier stuff. Is that true? I'm going to use two arguments, well, whether it's true or not. I'll use two arguments to say why I don't think it is all that helpful to think that way. And one of those arguments is just to use Bronfenbrenner's own words. The other is to say that although the first workings of the theory, when he wrote The Ecology of Human Development, that certainly is relevant to the argument that these three authors are making, but that the latest version is so much more relevant, and that's what should be used. Okay, that's the argument I'm going to make. But first of all, how is the theory portrayed? Very pretty, but it's a pretty inaccurate metaphor. This is from simplypsychology.org. It is ubiquitous, but it is simply wrong. And yet, if you do a casual look on the internet, or even if you look at many books that talk about theories of human development, theories of psychology, this is the image that you'll see. It's concentric rings. It's helpful to make us think spatially in an interesting way, which is the argument Paul has made very strongly, but we can go further than that, I think. Okay, so Paul said it's a pretty static model, despite the fact that it's concentric, and it doesn't consist of diametric opposites as well. It clearly needs more, he argues, a bidirectional movement across these dimensions to make it alive. Okay? I think he's got a point. So the question is, why are these things ubiquitous, and did Bronfenbrenner really think in terms of just concentric rings? And it certainly was a metaphor, because it's just a metaphor, I think, that he continued to use throughout his life. This is what he and Pamela Morris wrote in 1998, and it was reprinted with just a few additions in 2006. In addressing this topic, we return to the earliest formulation of the ecological model, there in 879 too. Today, as then, and they quote, the ecological environment is conceived as a set of nested structures, each inside the other, like a set of Russian dolls. Well, right. Sorry, I'll stop my talk there because obviously you're right. No, not actually. It was never intended. If you look at his writing, it was never intended as anything literal. For example, he wrote about the microsystem. A microsystem is a pattern of activities, roles, and interpersonal relations experienced by the developing person in a given setting with particular physical and material characteristics. And the developing person has active agency within each microsystem where time is spent. I think it was you, Erica, that in Deconstructing wrote that how can it be with the individual in the centre? No. And he actually wrote, Bronfenbrenner did, that one of the beginning of the innermost level of the ecological schema, one of the basic units of analysis is the dyad. 1979, page 5. Okay? The mesosystem is a system of two or more microsystems. It is not outside the microsystem, it's a system. The exosystem, similarly, it's not just outside that little developing individual, it's a context in which the developing person isn't situated at all. But nonetheless, that context indirectly influences it. as he said in 89, it deals ecosystem with the relations between two or more settings. And the macro system, I mean, he never wrote this. I can't find a single place where he did. But the macro system should really be thought of as multiple, not singular, because he talked about the macro system as subculture, multiple subcultures within any culture or society. And so people are currently always existing in more than one. In some subculture with race, class, ethnic background, region, locale, city, countryside, and the society as a whole. And all of these macrosystemic influences have their effect. So, why does it matter that he's misrepresented? I think one of the problems is that if you focus on the first phase of the development of a theory, it certainly allows the spatial dimension that's so important, but it ignores child agency and the interdependency that's actually built into the theory from the start. Is it built in? I mean, I think the metaphor and the notion of micro, meso, exo, macro system was so powerful in people's consciousness that the theory became known as just a theory of context. But in fact, even in 79, he wrote, "The ecology of human development involves the scientific study of the progressive mutual accommodation between an active, growing human being and the changing properties of the immediate settings in which the developing person lives, as this process is affected by relations between these settings and the larger context within which the settings are embedded." By larger context, I'm going to point out that he argued public policy was one of those larger contexts. And I'll talk a little bit about public policy from a Bronfenbrenner perspective later on. Similarly, he wrote, in ecological research, the properties of the person and the environment, the structure of environmental settings, and the processes taking place within and between them must be viewed as interdependent and analysed in systems terms. So this means that he's clearly treating the child as anything other than passive, but is involved in mutual accommodation. It's not a unidirectional flow from parent or context to child. It's not even a two-sided unidirectional approach, which is an interdependent one, where both context and individual are mutually influencing the other at the same time. As Sheila and Les wrote, agency is produced in relationships. True, that's exactly what he's saying. And they want to promote, quote, not individuality and autonomy, but a connected relational agency. So Bronfenbrenner went on. This is just in 79. In terms of research method, the child's evolving construction of reality cannot be observed directly. So what I want to say then is that the agency was already there for Bronfenbrenner in 1979. It was never a theory of context. It was an ecological theory. Ecology is all about the relations between the being, the biological organism, and the contexts within which that organism is developing. So I tried to come up with a different way of representing the theory, and that's what I came up with in 2008. I mean, it's still inadequate, but at least it's more appropriate than the concentric rings model. I'll come back to this a little later. Okay. So what was added in phase 2 in ecological systems theory? Interestingly, he wrote this in 1989. It said that since 1979, there's been too much focus on context. He wrote that book originally because, at least in the American context, psychologists really focus on individual factors only as far as development was concerned, and did not think about the natural context in which children were engaged. And he laughed about the studies of attachment with the strange behavior of strange children in strange contexts with strange mothers, all in the strange lab, and said, well, that's a bit stupid. You should be looking at how to actually develop in the real world. He wrote, I've been smuggling in theoretical ideas and relevant research findings that are core to human organisms, a more explicit and powerful role in its own development. He didn't really need to do that, as I've shown. When you read the 79 book, it's full of how individuals are actively involved in their own development. But in the second phase, he, for the first time, talked about developmentally instigative characteristics, and just had two, of which the developing structural attributes was surely agency, although he didn't ever use that actual word. He brought in, I think, a bit stronger notions of culture and subculture, and it was at this time that time had always been in the theory. People just ignored it. He decided to use a term chronosystem to say, look, guys, time actually does have an effect. I won't say any more about this because we're into a bit more detail about the third and final phase. So bioecological theory. It's funny, each time we try to make it more, here's the individual, bio, you didn't need bio, ecology already has the individual. But I think because people didn't see it, he wanted to make it clearer. And this is where I sort of take exception to the chronosystem thing, because, the chronocentrism thing, because he wrote in 1989 of the need for reassessing, revising, and extending, even renouncing some of the conceptions in the 79 book. And in subsequent papers he wrote, served to call the original model into question. Further, the present model introduces major theoretical innovations in both form and content. Today's bioecological model goes far beyond its predecessors, both with respect to basic constructs and their bidirectional synergistic interrelationships. So, I mean, as far as he was concerned, it was clearly, onwards and upwards and use it better. That does not mean you have to use it. I think there's nothing wrong with saying, I think that the ecology of human development is the appropriate theoretical model for us to use, and I'm going to stick with what you wrote there. That's perfectly fine. What I object to is people saying, I'm using transformative theory, and then only cite 1979 as though that's all he ever wrote. And then they get it wrong anyway. That wasn't you, sorry. And this is where, for the first time, he writes explicitly about the PPCT model as basically the thing to operationalize the theory, put it into effect. So what is the PPCT model? Proximal processes, person, context, and time. Proximal processes, these are the reciprocal activities and interactions engaged in regularly and becoming progressively more complex over time among developing individuals and the other people, objects, and symbols within their immediate environment. In 2001, it got a bit more explicit, saying that proximal processes are necessary for healthy human development. You need those. Okay. So not surprisingly, he called the engines of development. These are the driving forces, but they are modified according to the person characteristics of the developing person and interacting partners, the characteristics of the context, both immediate and distant, and time. All of these working together. So proximal processes may be the engines, but they are very much akin to what Michael Cole, Barbara Rogoff, and so on would call cultural practices, the things that we engage in on a regular basis. If they become progressively more complex over time, we get better at doing them. Person characteristics, three different types. demand, resource, and force. So he's expanded his notion from the second phase, and basically force, what he called it, the instigative characteristics earlier on, and what he called personal stimulus characteristics are really the same as what he called demand, and then resource was simply past experiences. These instigative characteristics, to instigate, is to actively involve oneself and others in activities, I think. So these things influence the everyday activities and interactions that we're engaged in. The more I like giving presentations, the more I'll try to do them. The fact that there's an audience here means I'm going to behave slightly differently than if there was nobody here, I guess. You're pretty boring. Context, I think we know, microsystem, meso, exo, and macro. I won't take any time about that. He also dealt a little more interestingly with time. Macro time is what he had termed the chronosystem. Micro time is what goes on in the course of these activities, interactions. So you have to study what happens during these interactions. Mesotime refers to how frequently these things occur. So I'm a dad, I've got a young kid. I've been in a book somewhere, probably in a psychology book. It's good to read with your child. So I get a book from the library, and that evening I read with the child. I take the book back. Done it. Will not be as effective as the same parent getting a book and reading every day with that child. Even more effectively, if the child says, "Daddy, can we do some reading now?" Okay, that's mesotime. We can't all study things over macro time. Macro time would be interesting to do, a study that takes into account a massive change in political regime. Trump becoming president, for example. You could do that. That will qualify as a macro-systemic change. Actually, some research that I did years and years ago, looking at nuclear war and adolescents' perceptions of it in the United States and Soviet Union. We collected data in a town in Russia, in Rostov, about their feelings of the other side and so on, and did that twice over the course of 5 years, and we applied for funding to do it subsequently. We didn't get funding, and the Soviet Union collapsed. What a great natural experiment that would have allowed us to look at chronosystemic changes. So a more appropriate representation, the representation is exactly the same, but it has words with it, and I think those words are absolutely necessary to make clear that proximal processes are the important thing. And in the interest of time, although I've forgotten, I started this, but it died on me. Oh, a second. I've got 30 more minutes. Right, that's fine. Okay, so you just need to 5 minutes. You just need to recognize the role of proximal processes, I think. Anyway, how can we operationalize this? And take that back. So one of the problems that people often have with this theory is to say, well, it's got so much. How could you possibly do any research using a theory like this? I mean, it's got proximal processes. Okay, so I've got to look at everyday activities that become progressively more complex. But I've got 3 types of person characteristics: demand, force, resource. I've got 4 different types of context from micro to macro. I've got 3 types of time. How on earth is it possible? Well, it's not if you think about it like that, but you don't have to. All Bronfman has said and implied was that you need to focus on proximal processes to see how they're simultaneously influenced by person characteristics and the context over time and situated in time. So you don't need all person characteristics. You need to look at just one characteristic, but two different levels of it. And the same with context. Depending on what your research interest is and what your outcome of interest is, you are free to choose what you would think of as being relevant, a relatively relevant person characteristic, and you look at two levels of that, high and low, whatever it should happen to be, and two different contexts of interest, whether it's two types of preschool classroom or United States and the Soviet Union, macrosystem, microsystem, it doesn't matter. What's relevant to your research interest? And you have to study both types of person characteristics in each context. And you have to do it so that you look at proximal processes. So you start off and so it works. So this means person characteristic, whatever it is, low in context A, person characteristic low in context B, and so on. You look to see how those two things influence the proximal processes at microtime 1. Well, as soon as children, adults, whoever you're interested in, whenever they've been engaged in some proximal process, in some context, they're going to change. And so is context. It won't be exactly the same context as it was before. So you now have time 1 can change from here to here. And again, the next time you see proximal processes, study those, it will again lead to slight changes. The change in the context may be much less obvious. The change in the individual might be much more obvious. Doesn't have to be. So you're studying necessarily, when you look at proximal processes, you're studying microtime. And if you do any sort of longitudinal research, you can look easily at mesotime. And even though you can't necessarily look at a change in the society, the economic situation, the political situation, you can at least situate your research in macro time because it matters. You do a study of how parents are with their children, with their adolescents, thinking about what they're going to do after school. And you do that at a time of a booming economy, and you do the same research in the same way at a time when the economy is collapsing, then it's not the same research. You've got to think about what's going on in the context of studying at that particular point in time. For years now, people have talked about psychologists being able to generalize their research from one context where they collected the data to a broader context from which they didn't, right? And so you have to take into account spatial context, can't generalize. You can't temporal context either, what you would say. I'm going to take the last few minutes to shift gears a little bit and talk about something that's relevant to the argument that both authors made, having to do with public policy. Let me first say, going back to that last operation, well, what I've been saying all along, Paul wrote, resilience rests on an assumption of human agency. This agency presupposes a mediating set of conditions between individual, environmental, and genetic factors. And I would argue that that's just what proximal processes does. It is that mediating condition. It's the place where individual factors and contextual factors come together and produce development. So, Martin read on poverty and changes in American families consistently throughout the time when he was writing theory, which we know a lot. And I should say that his 1979 book has been cited 42,000 times. That's a lot. His first article, called Beyond the Deficit System, which was one attempt to try to get public policy to move, has been cited since 1979 100 times. People have basically ignored the sight of him altogether. But he wrote this series of papers and an entire book talking about what was going on in American society. So he talked about an increase in working mothers with preschool or school-age children, and an increasing number of single parents. His argument, and that meant that there was a declining number of adults in the home. Both parents were out at work, or the single mother, she was out at work. What was going on with the kids? And given that there no longer was an expectation that grandparents would be living, although that wasn't true in African American families, they tended to be much longer lasting and having intergenerational connection. But what was happening to the kids? Given that his argument about proximal processes and their importance was that you need to be with someone who cares for you and willing to engage with you in the things that that person thinks are important, and at the same time, listen to what the child wants to do and see what you can do to aid that child. That's what proximal process is about. How do you do that if you're not there with the child? And given that, thanks to differences in social class, particularly in the United States, race, ethnicity, things like age of mother even, there were many, many more children living in poverty. That means that the parents or the parent are increasingly under stress. They're working full-time if they can, 2 jobs if they can, and then they have to go home and engage with their child in these ways that he thought so important. I mean, that's really not terribly likely. So he wrote in 1975, regardless of colour, families in similar circumstances are affected in the same way, for better or worse. What this means is that the disparity in the fate of white and black Americans in American society is a reflection of the way in which our society now functions, and hence is subject to change if and when we decide to alter our policies and practices. You recognise that you have to work at that level of macro system, societal level, in order to do things that would help the healthy development of individuals. I lived a couple of years in the Soviet Union in the 70s. I was teaching American and English kids. I used to speak Russian. I can read it now, but I can't talk. I have never, in any presentations before, used any Russian. Что делать? So I'm very proud of myself. It means what is to be done. And it was the title of a book written by Chernyshevsky in the 19th century about a young revolutionary. And Lenin deliberately used the same title to talk about what should be done in Russia leading up to the revolution. It's revolutionary, I think, and in the context of the United States particularly so. He wrote in 2002, the effective functioning of child-rearing processes in the family and other child settings requires establishing ongoing patterns of exchange of information, two-way communication, mutual accommodation, and mutual trust between the principal settings in which children and their parents live their lives. In contemporary societies, these settings are the home, childcare programs, the school, and the parents' place of work. It also requires public policies and practices that provide place, time, stability, status, recognition, belief systems, customs and actions in support of child-rearing activities, not only on the part of parents, caregivers, teachers and other professional personnel, but also from relatives, friends, neighbours, co-workers, communities and the major economic, social and political institutions of the entire society. All right, that's easy to say. How do you do it? He wrote what he termed were preposterous proposals. They were revolutionary. First of all, was this away with the deficit model. You can't treat individuals in any context, any society, as being the cause of the problem, particularly when it's not them who the cause of the problem. He blamed American individualism for the fact that if we succeed in society, we've pulled ourselves up by our own bootstraps, and if we failed, it's because we're pretty damn useless individuals. But that's so typical. Child rearing is the work of communities, not up to parents only, with governmental support. So that means you get low or no cost, we call it then, in 975 daycare, had to be available to everybody. There need to be linkages across families, schools, and the wider community. What did that mean? It meant that childcare centres should be attached to workplaces, that parents of young children should be enabled at any time to go to be with their kids, right? That the community had to be involved in child rearing. He talked about creating a curriculum for caring. He said it's outrageous that adolescents in this American society can have got to adulthood and have never picked up, or not for more than a couple of seconds, a baby, have never looked after. Never looked after an old person. He said that there needs to be a curriculum of caring, not where they're taught about caring, when they actually go into the community. They spend time in childcare centres, they spend time in school, they help kids to read, they go to places where old fogies are left to die, talk to them, engage with them, care for them. Well, how do you get parents to take some time off work to be with their children if they have to work full time? He said there shouldn't be full time for parents. It should be part-time work, three-quarter time, and paid enough so that you could spend time. So there had to be flexible and part-time employment practices. He said, who's caring for kids? You try it as always like it is. He said women are the ones who are looking after. They need to be, and think this is 1970s and 80s in the United States, they need to be the people much more involved in making policy. Need to stop the segregation of children at work, this curriculum of caring, and all these points over the years were explicitly linked to his theoretical propositions. If you want to know more about these particular papers, you can look at this Oxford bibliography online, where many of them are talked about. Okay, my gratitude to Sheila, Liz and Paul for the invitation and for your two very thought-provoking and helpful books. I really enjoyed them. Erica sharing in this event, and mostly actually to you, because like I said before, it would have been really boring talking to absolutely nobody. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Actually, a thought-provoking presentation. So, like the last time, I'm going to invite our three panelists to respond, 3 or 4 minutes each, and then we'll open the floor for questions. Thank you. So we might begin with Sheila.
Very much, John. Let me really interesting. And many of us in this room, I think, recognise the amazing contribution to developmental psychology made by Bronfenbrenner. And it was kind of unfortunate, I think, that people became very critical of him because of his popularity and because of the popularity and ubiquity of the simplistic kind of Russian dolls metaphor that you have reminded us of, because it does a great disservice to his work, and I think you've done so much to assess and remind us of just how revolutionary he was. And I think it's very striking that I think we tend to forget, well, I don't forget because I'm that old, but in the 1970s, it really was extraordinary in the context of that time, the way developmental psychology was focused on the individual child, which was completely isolated from context. So what Bronfenbrenner was doing, and then later Vygotsky, whose work became familiar to a few people at that time, was extraordinary, really. And even if you look at the graphic there, just the external, the macro system included political and economic systems. I mean, when you think about it from the point of view of your work, Erica, even though he wasn't thinking in the same way as you are at all, but at least he was recognizing that this was incredibly important in terms of shaping children's lives. And as you said, he was very regretful later, wasn't he, that his work was taken up as being about context when he had always emphasized the active child in the centre. But he needed to do quite a lot of work to convince people that this was the new, that it wasn't really a new theory, it was just asserting the importance of the child as an active and as a contributor to their own changing behaviour in the world. So I think that it's great for us to be reminded of this, and Jonathan has done more than anybody, I think, to remind us of the importance of Bronfenbrenner, not just an historical figure, but as somebody who's very relevant now. I'm interested, I mean, even though we didn't mention him much, I have written about Bronfenbrenner in other contexts, and I do feel he was very important, but that he now belongs really in his work to a stable of systemic thinkers. He is one of a number of systemic thinkers in psychology. And I think Liz would share this, that this is, we would say, as we've said earlier, that this really should represent the way forward for developmental psychology, and I think also for psychology as a whole, because we've got too much of this brains are us type thinking, this kind of regression, I think, in terms of the kind of models that psychologists are endorsing these days, and some of them with very dubious and harmful consequences, I would say. So this, I think, Paul acknowledges the importance of Bronfenbrenner in his interest in spatial, which was very much again pioneering in terms of psychology at that time, as well as the temporal. The later work of Bronfenbrenner, I think, really stands up in terms of assessment, and I think it's good to be reminded by Jonathan of his interest throughout his theoretical writings of the practical lives of children, of the effect of policies on children's lives. And again, that's something that very often psychologists forget about, the policy realm and the inevitable effect on policy. Psychology has effect on policy all the time, but very often the psychologists as such have just sort of they've presented theories and all the rest of it, but they don't engage with that world. It's left to educationists, to social workers and politicians to apply the ideas. So I think finally then, Jonathan, it's fascinating how we seem to need the graphic very often, especially when dealing with something complex. And Jonathan's own graphics, I think, have really, moved us forward in that way, because it is, I think, one of the challenges of any systemic model like Bronfenbrenner's and others with dynamic system theory is how do we operationalize them? How do we work with them? psychology in most of its manifestations is an empirical discipline. So we need to be able to make use of these theories in terms of the empirical, and you've given us a very good illustration of the way that can happen. And people like Phelan and Smith and others have done so equally. So thank you very much, John, for your presentation and for your response to our own work and how you've related it to the work of Ron. So thanks.
Thank you, Sheila.
Thanks so much, John, for your presentation on Bronfenbrenner's theory and indeed for all the work that you do around his theory. I think it's one of the overarching frameworks within the discipline of developmental science. Your continued efforts to educate us about his theory and to write about it are so welcome, and I draw heavily on your material for teaching, because we want our students to go beyond what's just presented in the general developmental textbook. And my reflection on the discipline is that developmental psychology is very theoretically rich. So, I mean, if you look at the most recent edition of the Handbook of Child Psychology and Developmental Science, Volume 1 is devoted fully to theory, and there are some really, welcome additions, like there's a whole chapter on children, on the development of agency within that book, and obviously Bronfenbrenner's work is represented there. And I suppose one of the challenges is how we get this work into the mainstream, because it's not, students don't read these, dense handbooks. And like you were saying, I also reviewed some key developmental textbooks for students, and they had all presented that picture of the nested circles, and not one of them had referred to this concept of proximal processes, which is really, lies at the core of Bronfenbrenner's theory. So I think there is, I suppose, work to be done in terms of us thinking about how we can continue to communicate those ideas and your ideas. And obviously writing books is a great way to develop theoretical ideas, but it's not something that's really rewarded within the university system, certainly within psychology, where the focus would be much more on writing peer-reviewed articles and getting citations and so on. And I suppose just the final point I'd make is about, as you continue to expand on, Bronfenbrenner's work and maybe deconstruct the concept of proximal processes a bit more, that we might think about how the concept of agency might, sort of come to the fore within his theory, because I think it is within the context of proximal processes that we see agency being sort of relationally enacted. And I also think in the context of today's world, where we have, huge growth in generative AI and artificial intelligence, that we begin to think about proximal processes in relation to these, I don't know what you call them, agents, robotic agents. And I suppose think about the implications of that for the exercise of children's agency, or indeed the constraints that it may sort of place on their agency. So I think that's something that, we should, as a society, become increasingly concerned about, and having that theoretical lens to drive forward those research agendas. Because, as you said, Erica, we have to ask what's in it and for whom. And those technology firms that are developing these models, they certainly don't have, whatever the best interest of the child might be at heart. And the UNICEF wrote a report in December 2025 called Guidance on AI and Children. And one thing it said was that AI systems should be designed to improve well-being facets of a child, such as their creativity, competence, and autonomy. And I don't know, for anyone who does or has used generative AI, whether you ever felt it, helped with your creativity or indeed your autonomy. Arguably, it does the sort of exact opposite. So I think we need to think about how these new technologies will disrupt how agency is, or how children develop their sense of agency and how agency is exercised. Thank you.
Nicole.
Thanks so much, John, for such a lucid, account of the distinct phases and sort of currents and strands in his work. And I'm so grateful to you for going into such detail to engage with our works, as well as the long journey and all of that. In terms of, as you know, like, I would take a different position to some degree. We're not probably as far apart, perhaps, as we might think. That I would be arguing that concentric space is a very distinctive theoretical conception that challenges Western cultural thinking, and that Bronfenbrenner's it's not just an intuition or a metaphor, and I would be concerned with seeing space as simply a metaphor. This is a strategy for neutralizing the impact of space. And I would draw on a common word that's used across both early and late Bronfenbrenner, which is the word system conditions. I think it's a hugely underemphasized term, because a condition for engines, the fuel behind the engines, is a key systemic aspect. So my focus is on spatial conditions, and I would argue that the concentric spatial model is very significant but incomplete. So I fully accept that it needs to be amplified, because in many ways it's a model of connection, it's a model of holism, and I think its virtues is that it challenges hierarchy, it challenges category type thinking, because you have interdependence between these various systems. So in my view, it's one of the most radical signature contributions of Bronfenbrenner is his concentric idea. It's not, as you note, it's not a peripheral concept. It's not merely a metaphor with Russian dolls. He talks consistently about a nested approach. So I argue that I critique him in that he didn't draw on earlier conceptions in structural anthropology of concentric spatial systems with Levi-Strauss's work. And Levi-Strauss, developed as probably part of maybe the insularity of some areas in developmental psychology that didn't do so, but so that the interplay between concentric systems of experience and diametric systems and monistic systems create a whole other way of understanding system change, system inclusion, and of course another weakness that I would see in that it's partial strength, if you look at it in the context of 1979, is that he does appeal to phenomenology, which is quite a remarkable psychology design. He was certainly ahead of the policy there, but his conceptions of phenomenology, as well as his conceptions of the individual as a system, is remarkably underplayed. So, for example, he doesn't engage with, as Freud would for a century earlier, the unconscious as a system. Yeah. About a century, okay, but back to the century now. So the unconscious as a system, our phenomenology as systems. So he does say in 79 that he doesn't have a predilection for existential phenomenology, but I would argue that this is a very interesting aspect for individual experience. So I would argue is that the concentric spatial system model can lead a spatial turn in the humanities. That I think it is a really interesting insight he has, and that but that it needs to be applied to the individual's experience, so the concentric space within. I would draw on other books of mine in terms of Carl Jung's mandala structure, that he sees the unifying archetype of the collective unconscious as a concentric spatial structure. So within that model, and you're right, and I think others such as Darling, I'm not calling you Darling, but there's a researcher called Darling who criticizes the notion of the individual at the center of these things. But you can go much further to say is that there needs to be more concentric circles of the various layers of the individual's experience there. Now, I'm not trying to subdue the later work, but I do think it's less remarkable. It's certainly more detailed. I would argue that part of what my concern with it is that I see a lot of diametric space in it that wasn't in the earlier stuff. And when I mean diametric space, he kind of at times he contrasts liabilities and assets. He talks about competence and dysfunction. So very much these diametric spatial oppositions. So he's kind of getting a kind of prescriptive developmentalism in some of his later work, and also he tends to emphasize directive belief systems And again, that is a flattening of phenomenology, in my view. So and I would see this comparable to the flattening Bruner would have noted for cognitive psychology. Bruner's work would have emphasized the shift from information processing to construction of meaning, and I would be concerned that the promissory notes towards phenomenology in the 79 work and regarding space are lost in the later work that become more, I would say that they're probably more, there's a strand in Bronfenbrenner that you draw on as well, Sheila, that you would emphasize the hermeneutic meaning construction dimensions in Bronfenbrenner. Not only the causal mechanistic, I know you say it's not just mechanistic, but that the approximate processes are more the kind of, the causal trajectory analysis. There's also the meaning making dimension as well, that is a strand. And I think I would argue that space can bring together the causal aspect with the meaning aspect. And to just explain a little bit of what that means, so for example, if you're looking at conditions for causality, the fuel for the engines of development, in that metaphor, it's a bit like, Luke Licker can be the greatest darts player with the basics, with the spatial condition of air, but if you ask him to throw darts underwater, the background spatial condition is not going to be so good. So in other words, the background framing conditions, our spatial frames, our framing conditions, can shape meaning in many different ways. And I would also, I think that the concentric model does not really look at system dysfunction. I see my former supervisor up there, Nick MacDonald, one of his terms is well-intentioned people in dysfunctional systems. So system dysfunction, and we all work and know systems where the left hand doesn't know where the right hand is coming from. So where a system is at odds with each other. So the concentric model does not examine system blockages, system dysfunctions in any deep way. So we do need to amplify and go beyond the concentric. We need a more dynamic model. We need a model of fragmentation, disruption, rupture. And I would argue that the concentric diametric interplay is a way to do that. And so I suppose I'm arguing for a plurality of paradigms for Bronfenbrenner. And I would also, I would challenge, I'm not saying reject, but at least question, the notion that the later one is more mature than the others. I think you can see through the history of ideas, many thinkers where their earlier work is more developed than their later work. R.D. Lang, a great systems thinker, you could certainly make a strong argument that the divided self, self-humanity, the mads of the family are stronger works than some of his later works. They were very interesting, but maybe not as rigorous intellectually. In philosophy, Heidegger's, early phenomenology, I would argue, is a much more rigorous analysis than his later work. So the notion that a later work necessarily is better than an earlier work in a thinker, I would contest. It may be in some thinkers, and we can disagree about, whether it is in Bronfenbrenner, but I don't, so I would urge you maybe to give the concentric earlier stuff a bit more breathing space as within a plurality of the brilliance of Bronfenbrenner.
Anything you'd like to say as an immediate response to that before we defer to our audience who have been infinitely patient, and apologies because we have run a little bit over time in terms of our presentations, but is there anything you'd like to say to start?
Well, I did have half an hour worth of response already prepared, but I think I'll forego that. I don't think that Bronfenbrenner was as wedded to the spatial stuff, which, why should he be? The fact that he talked a little bit about it, in one paragraph in the 1998-2006, does not mean that it was the route we thought. I think that we need to pay much more attention to this notion of proximal processes. It is an engine, but not as an engine. It's the place where active individuals and the context in which they're in come together. So they're both being changed. That's all I'll say.
So I'm going to open it up to our wonderful audience and give you an opportunity to ask questions. And don't worry, I have a bank here that I created earlier in case you don't have any. But I think it's opportune to invite you to speak at at this time. So, and if you would just say who you are and where you're coming from or your role, that might help also in terms of.
Just to note, the session is being recorded, but you won't be seen. Okay, you'll be heard.
Joe, thank you.
Yeah, Joe Travers, Director of the Centre for Inclusive Pedagogy here in the Institute. And I just want to thank you all, first of all, for your insightful contributions. My question is for Jonathan, and it's in relation to the PPCT part of the Bronfenbrenner model. And okay, the C is the context part, which there was a lot of emphasis on. I suppose my question is, why do you think the other components were either neglected, misused, underused in terms of application of the theory?
Thank you. Short answer, I think people don't actually bother to read Bronfenbrenner. I think they think they know it, so why bother? I mean, I've published 2 papers now in which one of my colleagues have drawn upon papers written by people who didn't just cite Bronfenbrenner, but who said that their work was based on Bronfenbrenner. And incredibly few of those papers actually have understood the theory. I mean, the broader answer of why that is the system that we work in doesn't really encourage deep reading or reflection. The system we're in encourages as many publications to be got out as quickly as possible. So if you can get what you need from reading an abstract or a title, or what you imagine to be the case, and can get something published, good for you. That's gonna bring you your reward. I'm asked to review papers all the time. I see the same thing. Citations, 42,000, that's a lot. Citing someone without reading them is just totally irrelevant. I see that even in my own stuff. People cite me and obviously haven't read the paper. So, you know, it's a pretty depressing response, but I think it's a true one.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, gentleman very back.
My name is Nick McDonald. I'm an organizational psychologist, so forgive me if this question is naive. It's not mine, but primarily it's Jonathan, but maybe the others. The focus has inevitably been on the microsystem and its context, in a sense. But I've got a question about the mesosystem.
About the what?
The mesosystem. How the mesosystem operates as a system, and issues to do with policy and governance, and actually how things work, and how to make things work better at that level, in a sense, right? Understanding what's happening with the microsystem. And I think certainly in my domain, there's too little attention to that. And it's treated as context, where they have much more focus. We know how to implement more effective policies to get the outcomes that actually are judged to be important in the microsystem.
Well, yeah. it's easier to focus on the microsystem than the mesosystem. But when Bronfenbrenner wrote about, for example, the workplace and the home in terms of public policy, what he's saying is that currently, when he was writing, these two important places where individuals spend so much of their time, as in adults, spend so much of their time, actually don't work together, but they work against one another. And then what policies need to do is look at the ways in which they can be helped to work together so that everybody, the adults and the children particularly, who are in the workplace and the home, can develop more appropriately. That, I think, is a mesosystem analysis. I've never looked at that ever, but it makes perfect sense. Just as we don't want to look at how children develop only in the home, they also go to school. They're also at grandma's house. They're also with their friends, their peer group. You need to understand a child's development. You need to see the way these different microsystems fit together. It's the same at the organizational level. You need to think about how policies at the workplace level impact negatively what's going on in the home, and vice versa. Because, of course, if a parent is stressed because of not having enough time, quality time, if you like, with the kid at home, and is therefore stressed because of that, how do they behave then when they're at work? If knowing that they're not doing an adequate job with their own kids because of their stress from work, they become more stressed at work because of the problems at home. It's a system.
Eber, thank you.
Excellent. And thank you all for a really great session. I was really struck by Sheila's point about maybe psychologists don't engage with policymakers as much as they might. And it could be really difficult to get complex research findings, let alone complex theoretical frameworks across stakeholders and practitioners. I just wondered if you thought there was any way in which some of the complexity around the notion of children, their agency, and how we view children could be better communicated. I know it's not an easy question, but just be interested in reflection.
Was it kind of when we were involved in the Children's Research Centre, that was a kind of preoccupation we had. We spent a lot of time talking about how to get across the results of research to policymakers. And at the time, we organised sessions with policymakers, invited them in, and then talked to them about how they'd like to see research presented. So we did a lot of summaries, like 1-page, 2-page summaries of research that we thought was relevant, things like children needing care at 18 or whatever. Just bring research together, not necessarily only some ecological research, but relevant research to whatever issue it was. And I'm sure this has been written about how to get research across policymakers, and there's a lot of different tactics that you can use. It's frustrating, though, as we've done, I don't know, working with, as you have done and Liz has done with say, on a long-term basis with the National Longitudinal Study, working with civil servants and policymakers who have a completely different time agenda and very different political kind of agenda. They want answers quickly. They want things that they can use convincingly to persuade people with the money to hand over money, etc. It's a very frustrating process generally, but one we shouldn't give up on, because we've seen, I'm sure you've seen, and anybody who's worked with trying to get results of research across beyond the academy, the dangers of when people pick up on research that is poor quality or actively toxic in some way or another. And so, we have to keep thinking about this if we're concerned about the policies that impinge on people's lives. But it's a difficult one.
If I may ask one question, because I don't see somebody volunteering in the audience, and put the focus on Erica, as Jonathan is trying to do here, in case you're feeling left out there, Erica. Just one quick question. I suppose in the context, we're here in an Institute of Education in the context of huge curricular policy reform in Ireland in relation to the primary school curriculum. And I love how you have, questioned and perhaps debunked the kind of things that we have held sacred in relation to primary curriculum development and reform. Things like child-centeredness and agency. Child-centeredness being a hallmark of our 1971 primary school curriculum, and agency more recently. And if I'm understanding your work in Child as Method and thinking about it correctly, it moves more towards focusing on things like solidarity and supporting children as political subjects. Can I just ask you maybe just to comment on that or elaborate in terms of the application of that perhaps in a primary context?
Gosh, I think there are so many different ways one could do that.
Yeah.
I mean, I've worked with, so there's a really great researcher in who's working at Leeds back at university, Mandy Pielejewski, who runs the early years programs there. And I mean, her engagement with these ideas, I mean, as you know, I suppose that maybe it also informed my formulations too, because we worked together. I mean, she kind of did work in early years classrooms, looking at the ways in which there's the whole schoolification process that's going on in early years education, and it's just getting more and more rigid. So she did a study that was partly about teacher subjectivities. She also documented the ways in which children whose first language wasn't English were sort of marginalised in all these processes. She's now doing. She's sort of taken up the trope of. She's formulated her own kind of approach, which she calls doppelganger as method, coming from the original ideas about the doppelganger in was it Gogol short story and other two the ways in which our sort of record making systems and profiling systems create an alternate other child that becomes the child that the teachers engage with often more than the child in the classroom. And now she's doing a lot more work looking at sort of embodied practices of engagement and refusal on the part of children as they are taking these assessments. She's literally, so I talked to her a few weeks ago, literally got permission because of her contacts in schools to sort of observe and record what is happening when these little children take these horrible, exams basically, and what is happening, in materially affecting their disengagement from educational processes. So there are all kinds of ways in which I think, as I said before, it's these kind of ideas, they only take shape as you put them to work in specific context with a particular sort of interest and question that focuses on the way in which the macro enters the meso, the micro. So there's huge overlap really in what we've been talking about. And I think dysfunctional systems are what we study all the time, really, aren't they?
Thank you for that.
And what we're in, yes.
Yeah.
I'm not a psychologist, but it listens with intrigue this afternoon. But the one thing that sort of seems to be missing in maybe not necessarily both presentations, I might be off base here, but attachment theory is about coming to play when you're looking at and addressing developmental theories around how children develop and grow. Because it seems to be the one thing that to me was missing here today. I'm not a psychologist.
Who wants to respond to that? I just say it's really interesting that you prefaced your comments by saying I'm not a psychologist and where is attachment theory. That is really interesting because I suppose that says such a lot about what the perception of developmental psychology, the general one is, and what it, because I see the material that is covered by attachment theory in both these books massively, but framed in a different way.
Just to say, in my earlier book, The Primordial Dance, I would have developed the reading of attachment theory in light of concentric and diametric spaces, going into the notion of phenomenology and the unconscious projections. Just one part of that would be the notion of ambivalent attachment, that, drawing also from Freud there, that the mirror image symmetry in diametric space as a spatial projection. There's quite a lot of mileage in some of those aspects, as well as assumed connection, a concept I would have taken from Carol Gilligan's work initially, but the notion of assumed connection in secure attachment, is resonant with a concentric relation space. That's without, there are obviously weaknesses to critique in terms of some of the limitations of attachment theory, but that there are different projections of relational spaces that can underpin attachment theory.
It's funny, we were talking about attachment theory earlier just amongst ourselves, a problematic thing for many psychologists in the sense that it has been taken up by other disciplines in education and social work and other policymakers without attention to the many issues that are surrounding this work on attachment theory, the fact that it's a neat typologies which actually don't work cross-culturally or across time, and a lot of these concerning issues around attachment theory haven't gone beyond some of the critical psychologists who are involved in examining it more closely. So it has been taken up in rather difficult, ways that are rather worrying. Maybe particularly in social work, I would be aware of it. To me, it's not a straightforward issue, and it's not what a thing that all developmental psychologists are sort of proud of and want to promote necessarily. You're more of say, I'm out of touch with what's going on in the teaching world.
Yeah, no, I'm not an attachment theorist by any stretch at all, but I can see it's a topic that students love and it's something that they can kind of relate to, but it can be quite thorny theoretically, and it's also very difficult to research because it's a little bit of a closed shop. If you want to apply any of the kind of measures, you have to be trained, and it's very expensive, and you have to go to these different centres of excellence and so on. So, yeah, I think there are other frameworks that we can draw upon and use within our study of development. We don't necessarily need to wed ourselves to that framework, notwithstanding the important contribution it's made to our understanding of children's emotional development.
Just like us coming off from the educational side of that, there's a Golding et al. Or a number of people in the UK who have really heavily pushed the notion that teachers should be reading the attachment styles of children. And we were talking about it earlier, that there are big concerns. I would have written a critique of over-emphasizing attachment theory in schools, because teachers really cannot make these assessments of any kind, formal or informal, because they're not observing the families, so it risks kind of quite intrusive judgments. But there has been a movement to make those type of judgments where I put this in the role of the teacher, and I think that is quite problematic.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Did you mean attachment theory per se, or did you just mean the idea of attachment? Because as you meant, everyone has so far responded by referencing attachment theory as a theory. And I was wondering whether you might just have meant, as a non-psychologist, the fact that young children, some are more clingy, some seem to be perfectly okay being not around their attachment figure.
I suppose coming from I'm a psychotherapist now. I've worked in prisons for 15 years.
Okay.
I'm now working with the HSC.
My experience of attachment is at the later stages when you're getting the backstory of an individual, say within the prison setting, and the attachment that some people have from early childhood experience or early childhood development, the breakdown, and that's where I kind of was trying to kind of tie in the attachment piece as to how that works, and the breakdown in the development of an early child to ending up in a situation where it's prison or other or worse. I'm just trying to make the connection between developmental childhood and the outcome. I'm sorry, I'm maybe I'm off base.
I mean, I would just say that the adult attachment interview and that kind of it's like such a different entity,
Yeah.
it seems to me, than empirical research. I mean, it's that developmental fallacy, it's sometimes called, of conflating people accounting for, reflecting on their past history, which as a therapist one listens to, yeah, versus looking at children in their interactions with others in real time and classifying things, and they're like different things, but they tend to get lumped together and that's one of the things we have to try and disentangle and look at, that they're not the same thing. Yeah.
I think we may draw things to a close. And before we do, just to reiterate our thanks to Jonathan, to Erica, to Paul, to Sheila and to Liz for a really wonderful evening of discussion and debate, and to show our appreciation for